Hey, you lovely lot, and welcome back to Crime Analyst, your go-to true crime channel here on YouTube for insight and expert analysis of cases. Now, today I'm going to be talking about the case of Nicola Bulley and the Coroner's Inquest, day one of the Coroner's Inquest. You asked me to cover it, and I said that I would, and I think it is important to deconstruct some of the headlines coming out of day one. And what I will say is that if you do look on the news coverage, there is just such a range of bizarre headlines coming out from what happened today. And I think that's quite unhelpful, actually. But as always, I think about Nicola and I think about her family and their quest to get answers, and they've had to wait a very long time. So I hope people report on this responsibly, because there are two little girls who want to know what happened to their mother. And of course, we all want to know what happened, and the coroner's inquest is an important part of that. So before I explain just some of the headlines that were important to me, I just want to say thank you so much to those of you who've subscribed to Crime Analyst. Thank you for commenting. Thank you for sharing me. Thank you for your super thanks. And if you haven't subscribed just yet, please do. Just hit subscribe so you don't miss out on future coverage. And I will be talking about day two of the inquest, which will be tomorrow, so June 26th, June 27. And most of you will know that I covered this case and tracked this case from the first week that Nicola Bulley went missing. And she went missing, she disappeared on January the 27th. And her body wasn't found until almost 3 weeks later on February the 19th. And people still say to me, well, why is this case of interest? Why is it getting so much coverage? And I say that all cases should get this much interest. When a mother of two little girls goes missing, and under very unusual circumstances, it's quite right that questions are asked. It's quite right that we all sit up and pay attention. And of course, in Nicola's case, there were very unusual circumstances. And that was one of the things for me that was really important. She had done very normal things that morning in terms of getting up, getting the girls up, taking them to school, dropping them off, then taking her dog Willow for a walk. And she was on a call, a work call, when she just seemed to disappear, and her phone and the harness were found, the dog's harness, Willow, but there was no sign of Nicola. And of course, the police said from very early on, those of you who followed my coverage, and please do go back and watch the videos because I talk step by step in terms of what happened regarding the investigation. And from very early on, the police said it was their working hypothesis that she had gone into the water. And that was something that was very curious to me and to many other people. Why did they suspect that she had gone into the water? And so one of my first questions really comes out of that when we think about the coroner's inquest, and that's, if they believe she had gone into the water, why were the divers not there sooner? And if they believe she went into the water, why did they not do the exercise of figuring out, based on the same time the next day, what the tide was doing and the depth of the water and where her body may have travelled to, rather than doing it months later and after her body had been found? So in this particular episode, I am going to be talking about what came out of the coroner's inquest, but also some of the questions that I still have. There are two questions that bother me right from the start. Now, just to say, a coroner's inquest is an investigation. It's a fact-finding investigation. So it's not about apportioning blame. It's about getting to the facts of who has died. So in this case, it's Nicola, but also where she died, when she died, and how she died. So it very much is focused around those facts. So Dr. James Adley, he is the coroner in the case. He explained this at the start of the coroner's inquest, and that was setting the scene, really, for what followed next, which was 16 witnesses who were called to give evidence. Now, those 16 witnesses were notified prior. They give a statement beforehand, and then they give evidence. And it was a range of witnesses from the pathologist, the Home Office pathologist, I should say, Dr. Alison Armour, the Senior Investigating Officer, Rebecca Smith, the police digital expert, Detective Constable Keith Greenhalgh, and a police diver, PC Matthew Thackeray, and a number of search and rescue experts and people who are experts in what happens when a body goes into water and how bodies move in water. And also witnesses who saw Nicola on the day, on January the 27th. Witnesses who the timeline could be plotted by and who could talk to her demeanour, how she responded and appeared on January the 27th, and also from Penny Fletcher, who was the woman who found the phone, Nicola's phone, and the harness, and then placed them on the bench. And we know that timeline is absolutely key, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. And Penny Fletcher also found Willow and tied Willow up. Now, she said that Willow was giddy, not chaotic, but giddy. So I'm going to get into what some of the key things are that the witnesses said. And I'm going to start with the pathologist, because she is a very important person in this in terms of the medical side of what she believed happened to Nicola, having examined her. And importantly, what Dr. Alison Armour opined was that Nicola Bulley was alive when she went into the water on January the 27th. She also opined that she died by drowning. So she went into the water, she was alive, and her lungs filled with water, and she drowned. That was the cause of death. And she said there wasn't anything remarkable about that. She did say that there was no evidence of alcohol in Nicola's system. Now, that's important as well, given that the police did say that some of these specific vulnerabilities regarding Nicola were that she suffered or was struggling with the menopause and was struggling with alcohol. So this sort of sowed the seed that perhaps she was unstable, there was something going on for her, and she may have taken herself into the water. So on the alcohol side, that can be ruled out. That's important. And of course, I've talked about that before. It sounds very victim-blamey, particularly when you're coming under fire in terms of questions about your investigation, and that's what you come out with. And we women, me included, feel that women should be treated with dignity and respect, and that if you flip the script, that wouldn't be said of a man. So these double standards are important to point out. But the pathologist, Dr. Alison Armour, said there was no alcohol in her system and that there was no evidence that she had been harmed before she fell into the water. So what she was talking about was in terms of physical contusions or anything on her body that would have indicated that she had been hit over the head, for example, blunt force trauma to the head. There was no signs of that. And I want to come back to that. Now, Senior Investigating Officer Rebecca Smith also gave evidence, and she talked through the investigation, she talked through the timeline. So again, very important to understand that sequence of events. And she opined that there was no evidence of third-party involvement whatsoever. That word, whatsoever. Now, I just want to highlight there are no absolutes in a case like this. And what you will hear at the coroner's inquest is lots of people giving their opinion. And of course, it's the science that we rely upon. But with the science and with the water and tides and what happens when a body goes into the water and movement, you'll start to understand that different experts have different opinions. So it's much more about an opinion. This is Senior Investigating Officer Rebecca Smith's opinion. She's an experienced detective. So that's important too. And the digital expert for the police, DC Keith Greenhalgh, agreed that there seemed to be no evidence of third-party involvement. And I'm going to come back to that point. The coroner's inquest also heard from a number of experts, as I've already mentioned, talking about what happens when a body goes into cold water. And the water on January the 27th, the police diver said that it was 3.7 degrees Celsius. So not freezing, but very, very cold. And Professor Michael Tipton said that when a body goes into water, particularly if you're surprised by going into water, there can be a powerful cold shock response. And yes, I can agree with that. I do go into bodies of water, cold water. I've done open swimming. lots of different types of swimming, and a lot is reliant on breath and practicing your breath response. You can gasp and take in water, and more so your body can have a physiological shock response too. So going into a cold body of water, her body would have reacted. She may have gasped and may have taken in 1 or 2 gulps of water. So the intake, breathing in water in that way, it can take 1 or 2 to be a lethal dose for the lungs to start to fill. So that's important for us to understand. And yes, the experts that gave evidence are world-renowned experts and very experienced. And yes, that may well have happened. But there's a contrary argument, and I'll explain it in a minute, because I do just want to talk about Dr. Lorna Dennison-Wilkins, who's a National Police Search Advisor. Again, experienced. She is an expert in bodies and movement in water, and she talked about the fact that Nicola may have been buoyant initially. So what she was wearing, she may have floated initially, but then she would have sank, and she would have sank due to the negative buoyancy of her jacket and what she was wearing. And I talked about this in another video. If she sank, she would have gone straight down. But we know that the first diver who also gave evidence, the first police diver, PC Matthew Thackeray, he was there at 4 p.m. and he went into the water. So we'll talk about the timeline in a minute. At 4 p.m. going into the water, and the police divers didn't find Nicola, despite the fact that Dr. Lorna Dennison-Wilkins talked about this sinking, that she would have sunk down. So my question is, how far would her body have travelled in that body of water from the time she entered the water to 4 p.m. that afternoon? Because remember, the police divers didn't find her, and then there were searches undertaken by Peter Faulding, and he used sonar, and he didn't find her. So that's a question for me still that's outstanding about Peter Faulding and his findings, and then what some of the experts are saying about what would have happened to her body, and also the question about why he wasn't called to give evidence at the coroner's inquest. That's a question I can't answer, but it seems to me to be an oversight if this is a fact-finding inquest and investigation. I would want to know exactly what he found and how he searched and when he searched and so on, particularly with sonar. Because if her body did sink down, let's say it did move along and travel, maybe it did get stuck under a tree, but that's possible. There were trees underneath, but the sonar would have picked that up. So I want to know more about that. The other questions that I have also are the 2 ear witnesses gave evidence that they heard a scream. Now, they heard a scream that was like a short, sharp shock, a surprised response. And I think like when you get a real shock or a surprise, and Helen O'Neill gave evidence to that. She said she was in her garden that backed onto the bench and the river, and she heard that scream. She was in her garden around 9:35 a.m. and she did report it after she found out that Nicola was missing. And Veronica Clayson also said she was in the car park, she heard a scream. So that's significant, a short shock, a surprise response. And also some of my other questions are about the phone. Her phone and her harness were found on the ground. So also if you're taken by surprise, might you be holding those things in your hand? She dropped those things, or was she sat down? I don't know the answer to that. But what was the ground like where they suspect that she may well have gone in? Were there marks of someone skidding or tripping? And I don't know the answer to that. And obviously, as more and more people appeared later on, perhaps because we know the bench and around the area wasn't sealed off by a cordon, perhaps we will never know that answer. But I think it's important, along with the fact that a witness, Richard Fife, gave evidence that he saw Nicola, and he says that he saw her, and also importantly, a man in black who was wearing black trousers, a black top. He was around 6'1", about 45 years old, walking towards Nicola. And that was around 9:10 to 9:20. Now, he said he saw that man who seemed a bit strange walking towards Nicola around 9:10 to 9:20. So we're getting back into the timeline. But was that man ever identified? Because for the police to say that there was no evidence whatsoever of a third-party involvement, who is that man? Was he identified? I don't know the answer to that, but it seems that that's a line of investigation that needs to be pursued. Now, the Fitbit data and the phone data, I talked about the Fitbit from early on when I found out that she was wearing one, and it seemed that there was no discussion about the Fitbit. Well, now we know from DC Keith Greenhalgh that the Fitbit data between 8 a.m. and 9:30 a.m., there were 4,548 steps counted on the Fitbit. And then after 9:30, nothing. Now, this is very important because when we think about the phone data, at 9:18, there was the last human interaction on Nicola's phone. And then at 9:22 a.m., the Fitbit records her highest heart rate. So this might possibly have been the time she went in. That's what DC Keith Greenhalgh said. And then what happens thereafter between 9:22 and 9:30 in terms of her heart rate and steps? Does it stay elevated and high? And what about the steps up until 9:30? What's happening? That's quite important to know. And yes, you can opine that she went in at 9:22, but what if the scream and the heart rate increase were at the same time and she went in later? So that key time period is important. And I also thought the police initially said that the Fitbit wasn't synced to her phone and to her account. So that was a question that I had from early on, but it seems that now there is data. And that data is still very important to me when we're piecing together the timeline of what happened. Because the coroner summarised from day one that Nicola Bulley went into the water most likely after 9:18 a.m, but before 9:30 a.m. So I believe in what the experts have said, that Nicola did go into the water and that she did drown. But the key question is, for me, how did she get into the water? How did she get into the water? Did she take herself into the water? Well, we know there wasn't alcohol in her system. I didn't like that whole line of her taking her own life, particularly given all the aspects of her behaviour, of future planning, of taking the girls to school, of people on the dog walk saying that she just appeared normal, she stroked other people's dogs, she engaged as normal, she sent emails, she future planned a date, a play date with the children, she jumped on a work call, just all these things that told me that that wasn't a probability with this case. Did she fall in? Well, that's a possibility. But we don't know about the ground and what happened there. And it's just a few minutes that we're talking about. Did she fall in or was she pushed? Equally, a push may not show up physically on you, but it cannot be ruled out categorically. And you have to keep an open mind. All the facts, all the information, all the evidence. How did Nicola get into the water? That's really important, because I do believe that she was in the water and it was a surprise. And we know that most people who enter a cold body of water and it's a surprise to them, they weren't expecting to go in. We know that 44% of them do drown. This was a cold body of water. Also, the fact that within just under 3 weeks, her body was found and it had only travelled less than a mile. So that's curious to me, as I said. I would want to know how that can be explained. And Peter Faulding is an important part of explaining. He's an important part of the case file. You can't just ignore him. That doesn't feel right to me. And I would want to know, why he has not been called to the inquiry. So for me, there are more questions here. And as always, I'm thinking about Nicola and I'm thinking about her family and I'm thinking about her 2 little girls who want answers. And I don't believe it's right to have these sensational news headlines. There are always some things with cases that you just cannot explain. But I do believe there are more questions to be asked here. Day 2, tomorrow, June the 27th, the coroner's inquest will hear from Paul Ansell and also from Nicola's sister Louise Cunningham. So there's still more witnesses to be heard from before the coroner hands down his findings. So I'm going to end there, thinking about Nicola, thinking about her 2 little girls in particular, and her family and her friends. And I will be covering day 2, as I said. So until then, be curious, ask questions, and always trust your instincts.